Shabbat Shalom, everyone. If everyone please stand. Glorious and most honorable Father, His name is Yahweh. Father, this is your servant, Con Eli Haller Hawkins, coming along with your great man, Father, from here at Abel, all of us being a seed of the seventh Malach in these last days, our great teacher, and the only one sent to speak on your behalf in these last days, the great Kahan Yisrayl Hawkins, and through the authority of a high priest who has been placed over your great house, the great Yeshua Messiah. Most righteous fathers, do come before you once again upon the dawn of this holy Shabbat. We do thank you and praise you once again, Father, for giving us this day that we may come out of the sin-sick world to sit at the feet of the one sent in these last days, that we may take hold of your plan, Father Yahweh, and learn of your ways and understand what our jobs are in these last days, Father Yahweh. And we do pray that our minds would be continually open to your word, and that we would perceive the knowledge which is being brought forth in abundance from your great house by the anointed seventh Malach in these last days. And Father, we do pray for our great teacher, that you would be with him, guide him, strengthen him, and bless him, and that you would continually give him the strength to bring forth this message, Father Yahweh. And we do pray for our minds to be open with wisdom and knowledge, that we would understand the things that he is asking of us and needing from us, that we would be able to assist him, Father, in all things and fulfill our jobs. And we do pray for the knowledge and wisdom to do so. We also do pray for all those who are overseas, Father Yahweh, that are watching at this time, that you would be with them, guide them, strengthen them. And we do pray for the soon release of the great Kanya Didia and all those who are bound in prison, that they may join in this work. We do love you and thank you for all things, Father Yahweh, and do pray that you would be with us throughout the remainder of the Sabbath day. Mr. Yeshua Messiah, we do ask all of these things, being a seed of the seventh Malach. Hallelujah, Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. Everyone may be seated. We're going to be continuing once again in the 10th book of Yisrayl, part 1, Believe into the One Sent. Tonight we're going to be in chapter 8, and it's part of the series of the teachers of Babylon who threatened to kill Uremia for speaking the laws of Yahweh are now called Catholic, who came from the Holy Roman Empire. We're on number 16, and it's entitled Earthquakes Everywhere, and it's spoken of Matthew 24:7. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence, disease epidemics, and earthquakes in place after place. And once again, the sermon was given on February the 27th of 2010. Now, Pastor starts off in the sermon by going into detail about how the world is suffering big time at this time. Now, not only then, but it's still suffering today. In fact, it's getting worse. It's progressing in a state to where this world is starting to crumble, in more than one way. The leadership of this world is crumbling, has been crumbling ever since its conception. It's always fought against itself, one hand trying to cut off the other hand, cut the throat to spite the belly, so to speak. And it's been continual war ever since that system, that serpent, as we've been going over during workshops in the second book of Yisrayl, that serpent that approached Eve, which we know was a political or religious system, came against mankind, corrupt mankind, allowed these thoughts to be taught to mankind. Instead of a light bringer, they brought deception. They were trying to teach man that there was a better way, that you can get what you want, you can get the fun things out of life without keeping those rules. You can actually do what you want to do and achieve the final results of what Yahweh has said. Has He said, if you do this, surely you will die? You won't die. You're not going to die. And we see that in mankind today, even through not only the religious systems, but even the medical fields themselves, trying to prolong one's life, trying to cut out this, take a little of that, give you a little bit of this, anything but tell you to stop the sin that began the actual death in the first place. That just goes to show the corruption of the system and the ignorance of the leaders of the system, like as the book of Romans says, calling the simple ones wise, but even the wise in these last days actually becoming foolishness. Now, once again, the world is suffering big time, and he starts out this sermon talking about the earthquake that took place in Chile, which was an 8.8 on the Richter scale, and it was an earthquake that was so massive that it actually shook the foundations of the earth. In fact, news reports came out later saying that the earth was moved off its axis. Then it measured in inches, they measured it in inches, but it was actually showing it was so grand, so strong that it actually done so. And in verse 3, pastor's reading a news article, and it says, a massive earthquake shook South Chile early Saturday morning, killing at least 78, knocking down homes, buildings, hospitals, and churches, triggering a tsunami that they're expecting to hit as far away as Japan. Now, we're talking about South America and actually going across the Pacific to actually hit Japan. And it wasn't long after that Japan suffered a great earthquake. They actually suffered one on the 26th, but they suffered one that actually shut down their nuclear facility in Fukushima and actually raised many alarms over there with the energy that they were using, the nuclear energy, and it actually showed how mankind had created a technology that if something was to go wrong, they couldn't stop it. They didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't have the first clue on what to do if something of that magnitude was to occur. But what Yahweh is telling us in these last days, these things do not have to occur. They don't have to take place. We can prevent them. The earth is crying out because, as Isaiah says, it's the sins of the people. It's the sins of the people, the curses of the people. That is why the earth is crying out, because of the inhabitants of the people, because of the sins they've committed through the defilement of the earth is crying out. It actually is mourning. It's crying out. Remember, the earth is a living entity. Pastors brought that out. It's a living entity, and it suffers with our sins. It actually suffers. We can see that in the soil. We can see it in the food crops. We can see that all around us. But where we see it at, and Pastor was talking about it this time, was with earthquakes. Now, since the sermon, there's been massive earthquakes take place in Turkey. In fact, with aftershocks actually causing much damage also, but taking place all around this world. Pastor also brought a map that day, and he was showing the enormous amount of earthquakes that were taking place, and more earthquakes are taking place in these last days than ever before. And we even see them here in America. In fact, many people, it was just a few weeks ago, actually felt the earthquake that was east of Oklahoma City. They actually felt it here in Abelin. Reports were that it was felt all the way up into Wisconsin. The earthquake that took place, once again, east of Oklahoma City. We were actually, back in July, we were in the state capitol on a missionary trip. And it wasn't but a few weeks after that there was an earthquake there that actually shook Washington, D.C. to the point to where the Washington Monument, that is the centerpiece right there of all the conglomeration of the stuff you see, that monument's the centerpiece between the White House, the Capitol Building, the Lincoln Memorial, and also the Jefferson Memorial. It actually shook that to the point to where if you've seen the video footage inside, the actual inside started crumbling apart. I was surprised to see how much damage actually took place inside that thing that will shortly be taken the rest of the way down. But the damage, praise Yahweh when it is taken down. But, not to get off the point, but you would be surprised how many people, when you go there, look at that and they stand in awe trying to figure out what it is and why it's there. Pastor wrote about it back in the 70s. I know it's in Mark of the Beast Volume 1. He goes into great detail about it, but they really don't even know. And we've actually had questions. One of the deacons that was with us one time, there were some people who were from the Orient. It was obvious they were Asian. I don't know what part, but they actually come up and they ask him, what does that thing represent? So he took the man aside, explained it to him, and let him explain to his wife. But it is hard to explain things like that because people look at you and they think, why? Why on earth would somebody do that? Well, that just goes to show how sick the minds are. When you see the Catholic Church and all of their nudity that takes place with their statues, you go to Washington, D.C., every building you go to has some form of nudity. It's a disgrace. It's a dishonor. It's actually an embarrassment to actually be there and see the things with children. And you explain that it's beneficial when you're in the house of Yahweh and you're telling the children, look, this is what mankind has created. This is what everything is based around, this sex, sex, sex. Now, what does that have to do with the earthquake in Chile? It has everything to do with the earthquakes in Chile, with the earthquakes in Turkey, Japan. It's the sins, these sexual sins, this committing of abominations with bestiality, fornication, adultery, and sodomy that are allowing these diseases to not only torment mankind, but the earth is crying out I could only imagine if the earth could speak what it would be saying. It would be saying, listen to the seventh Malach. I'm dying here. But Yahshua Messiah knew of these things, and he spoke of these things. In verse 8, Pastor goes on to say, he wants us to turn over to Matthew chapter 24. And he says, because we're in that time period for this to start taking place, and it started taking place big time. And Yahshua shows that this is going to be just before the end, and just before you're called. The last one that will hit is in New York. And there's no telling how many more will hit besides the one in New York. Now, that's not something new that Pastor brought out. In fact, in the Mark of the Beast, Pastor goes into great detail. Volume 1, he wrote this back in the 70s. And you can actually read about that on page 128 of the Mark of the Beast. And it goes all the way to page 138. And he shows how the city is divided into 3 areas. The first area being Staten Island, the second area being Manhattan and the Bronx. That composes the second, and the third being Brooklyn and Queens, that actually bring together the third part. And everyone should go back and reread the Mark of the Beast, volumes 1 and 2. Pastor's been hitting that greatly, and the great Kahan that has a lot of time on his hands to study a lot. That is what he's been telling everyone that goes to see him, the great Kahan Yedidia. Read the Mark of the Beast. Read the Mark of the Beast. And when you go back and you read these things, just like you should be paying very close attention in the workshops, when we're going through the Going on to Perfection series, listening to the sermons pastors brought years ago. And it really will firm up your mind. It will set your foundation sure to know the man is teaching the very same thing today that he taught in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s. And it's the people that change. It's the people that they want to hang on to sins, just like in the days of Samuel. Those are the ones that say, well, the house of Yahweh used to stand for righteousness, but they got away from it. But the house of Yahweh stands for the same thing today as it did yesterday, and it will stand for the same thing tomorrow, as long as we stand behind Yisrayl Hawkins. There's no doubt Pastor's going to stand for Yahweh. Now we need to fulfill our jobs in standing behind Yisrayl Hawkins. That's our jobs, to stand behind him, to assist him in doing this work in each and every way in which we can, to lay down our very lives to do this work and to assist Yahweh's seventh Malach. Now in verse 11, Pastor, he goes on to say that Yahweh is fulfilling a plan that was from the beginning. Of course, the seed of Abraham, that is, with the lineage of Abraham, his descendants, which are more than just Isaac. Remember, Yahweh said, only this family have I dealt with, Yaakov. Remember Isaiah 2, chapter 2, verse 2. Only this family, the family of Yaakov, you and your descendants have I dealt with only. But he chooses the worst. He chooses the worst. As when Yahweh went into Egypt, he chose the worst. He chose the worst of the worst. Pastor says in verse 12, now that bunch that came out of Egypt is not the worst. You're the worst sitting here in these last days. The very worst. Now that's something we should think about if we were to look at our brother and think about how, he just can't seem to get it right. I can't believe Yahweh even called that man in these last days. Well, remember, Yahweh categorized you in that same boat that you're categorizing him in. And that's why you're here in these last days. Yahweh doesn't need someone that thinks they're so wise that they went to college for 4, 6, 8 years, whatever, and they're $100,000 in debt to explain away on how you can eat pork if you cook it well enough. And that's the stupidity. And it's not to be mean or to make slanderous remarks toward people in the world, because I have no doubt that there are people in the world that their intent is to help people. I don't doubt that one bit. And I don't doubt there's people in political offices that when they first began to run for those political offices, their intent was to help people. But once you get into the system and you start seeing what takes place in the system, you realize you're a voice among many. Once you go to school to be a doctor, and your intent may have been to help people, but once you're $200,000 in the hole, it doesn't take long for greed to set in. Because now you've got to pay your way out of the hole. And those repeating customers that you sell the medication to, that's, if the world would just stand behind Yisrayl Hawkins and explain how you're dying, what sin is, and what you need to do to change. Just stand behind Yisrayl Hawkins. We can make such a drastic change even by the first of the year. If people would start today, if they would start today to follow what he said, get out of these sinful relationships, start doing things, putting down their lives for their fellow man, laying down their lives for their fellow man, not trying to market their fellow man to get as much money as they can out of him, and then it becomes a burden. Let's cut him loose and drop him. That doesn't work. But if they were to actually look at each other, as the Peaceful Solution teaches, have value all life, all things, respect them. If we were to do that, we can make a drastic change. That's why we see the benefits of being in the house of Yahweh. When we're in the house of Yahweh, that should be the first thing on our minds when dealing with each other. What is the peaceful solution to this problem? How can we solve this problem? There's no doubt, and there should be no doubt in anyone's mind, the house of Yahweh has the answers for all things. Now, in saying that doesn't mean that we have the answers for all things individually. We have access to the answers. Just because you come, you spend the feast at Yahweh's house, don't mean you're ready to go tell the world what they're doing wrong before we fix our very selves. That's not what Yahweh's doing. He's making the bride ready for the groom. And that's what Pastor is doing with us in these last days. The patience that this man has shown in dealing with each and every one of us, and still does continually, in rehearsing things, going over things, rehearsing them, and being very patient and long-suffering. You can actually see the character of Yahweh within him, because we are the worst in these last days. And that's what Yahweh has given the seventh Malach to work with. That's what he has to work with, the worst of the worst. A challenge greater than even Moshe had. But Yahweh has shown through these scriptures he wanted to do this because he says that every knee is going to bow to him. Now they won't all be chosen for eternal life, but there are going to be a great many that will be out of those 12 tribes that are fulfilling a purpose, but not the will of Yahweh. The ones who fulfill the will of Yahweh and keep his laws, like Samuel and like Abraham and many of the others, they will have their part in the first resurrection, which these earthquakes are leading up to, as is shown in Revelations. And Pastor says, I hope to get through that today, trying to continue on to bring out this message, this instruction, in building us up, telling us and showing us that Yahweh has chosen us. Once again, this one family that he has worked with in these last days, under the one sent, a lawgiver, as it were, to speak to the people, to the family of Yahweh, that Yahweh continually reminds himself of every day. A constant reminder every day that sits before his throne of this great family and the lawgiver that he has, the one sent in these last days. Now, Pastor goes on to say, that's what we see in the house of Yahweh today. People who he's called for several years now. And Pastor says he came here in 1967. And in 1969 or around 1970 is when the first prophetic word he put out. Now, just think of how much energy and strength it took for him to get this done with the few people that were there to help, which were most likely the ones that were living in his household. And then remember when services first started in his living room, then it grew to the mobile sanctuary. And then it proceeded from there up until the press room. And then the press room, if you've ever been to the press room and looked around, it seems odd to consider that at one time the people fit in the sanctuary. And then the sanctuary when it was built. It's far grander now than what it was when it was first built. It's grown leaps and bounds, and it's continually growing. But this is what Yahweh told the pastor, to do this job, to set forth and to bring out this message, and I'm going to give you the worst of the worst, and they're going to be my family. Now you can imagine how Satan is training these people, great detail in these colleges. Remember the video that was showed one feast where it was actually a commercial for the Catholic Church. And they actually brag about, we started education. Colleges began with us. But what do they offer besides debt, more debt, and death? And Yahweh has said, you can take these people, you train them in your way. I'm going to take the lowliest of the low, the sorriest ones on the face of this earth, the ones you want nothing to do with, the dumb ones. You're going to call them Okies, actually. And I'm going to tell you that 6,000 years before it even occurs, that they're going to be called Okies. And they're going to cross this bridge, and they're going to be born, and they're going to be named Buffalo Bill. That's the mind of Yahweh. 6,000 years, or even more, before this actually took place. You know, one thing that was interesting about the bridge that Pastor's mother and father crossed over in Purcell, going from Purcell into Lexington, the real interesting thing is, remember there was a bridge before that. And it was the bridge where the mules were slipping and they couldn't hold them back, so his father had to let him go. And it was in Chickasha, Oklahoma. And it's a real steep bridge. If you've ever seen the videos, it's really, really steep. In fact, it looks like an arc, actually. But the interesting thing that when they came off of that bridge, you know, they didn't stop. They stopped for a short time because labor pains started, but they subsided, if you remember. And to the right-hand side, remember, now in Lexington, when they went across the bridge in Lexington, from Purcell to Lexington, Pastor's father went over to the right-hand side. That's where he was born. But that bridge in Chickasha where labor pains actually started, and remember what was taking place at that time. Satan was killing 6 million people trying to extinguish the two witnesses in those last days, or these last days. That first bridge in Chickasha actually ended up being a POW camp for Germans during the war. That's what's on that first bridge. That's what actually was built there. It's actually the fairgrounds now, but we thought that was very interesting when we went back and we seen that, and when we heard that, considering what was taking place and the mind of Yahweh to know not this bridge but the next. It makes you stand in awe to consider what Yahweh has said and the knowledge that Yahweh has. And for anyone to doubt the seventh Malach, it doesn't make sense, because you're doubting Yahweh Himself. You truly turn your back on Yahweh to doubt the seventh Malach. And Yahweh said all of these things and showed all of these things many, many thousands of years before they ever took place. Now, whether you know it or not, these earthquakes are a blessing. These nuclear wars that are building right now, they're going to be a blessing also. Well, how are these things going to be a blessing? We are blessed because we believe without seeing. You believe that if you eat pork, you're going to die, that it puts in a bug inside of your body that your body can't handle, and it will eventually kill you. You should believe by now with every ounce of energy that if you go out into this world and you fornicate, you're going to die. You're going to put something in your body that your body cannot handle. And it's going to break your body down. Well, this world doesn't believe. In fact, right now, today, the biggest shopping day of this pagan festival season, they're in their fantasy land mode. They'll line out stores to go shop, to buy garbage they'll never use. I even heard a report this morning where somebody went into a Walmart and sprayed other people with pepper spray just so they could get a video game or a console. Actually sprayed the other customers with pepper spray so they could get it. Now that's the mindset. That's the true love. Yeah, that's true love, all right. Love your neighbor as yourself until Black Friday, then kill him to get whatever you want. You know, and the things they're going to get are wasted money. The food they should have bought, the things they should have done, but they're going to have to see to believe. That's why these things are a blessing. Remember, Pastor said we will go for eternity teaching. If you do this, this is what it will bring. I know, I was there, I seen it. I stood with the seventh Malach in these last days. I seen what took place, and Yahweh, through the seventh Malach, warned us. He told us, this is what's going to occur. Dying, you will die if you do it. If you've never had the, I wouldn't say privilege, but the actual opportunity to see someone actually rot, to see a body actually rot, crumble, and fall apart, then you really understand how much eating unclean food will do to a body. There's pictures in the Mark of the Beast of when AIDS first started. And they have a picture of a man in there. He's nothing but skin and bones. But now HIV is bad. But now we're finding out that HPV is killing more people than HIV. We just call it other things. The only person that called it heart disease, throat cancer, cervical cancer, prostate cancer, and some other cancers that I won't make mention of, well, he was proclaiming these things 40 years ago, but no one would listen. But today is supposed to be a new revelation. It's amazing that these things are coming out, but they still won't repent of their sins. They still won't repent. In verse 20, Pastor goes on to say, you're the worst bunch on the face of this earth, or were, and you're becoming the best people of the whole universe. That's why Yahweh wanted the worst of the worst. Because Yahweh's way makes perfect. It actually brings a man to completion. It will actually help fix a man to be able to serve his brother, to serve his fellow man, to build up a righteous family, to train his children, and to have his children become a benefit to society, and they train their children. And it's a continual process, a continual building of a family. Now, over in verse 22, Pastor goes on to say, as for the other people, yes, they will be tried, they will be resurrected. Some of them have been tried already, but they have proven that they would, and they had proven that they would be obedient. But in this article, they were talking about the way I used to live when I was a child, the way everyone did in Oklahoma. When I was a child, up until 100 years ago, everyone lived this way. Now, what way is he speaking of? He's speaking about that they were actually living without electricity, being piped into the house, with water, actually having the access of water. And before these lights you just flip on and leave on, they were using kerosene and candles. And that's the way it was in the temple, Pastor says. But the people of this world today, you could flip out the lights. You could flip out the lights in some of these houses, and I truly think people would not know what to do. They wouldn't even leave the house. They would go crazy. I was just had the benefit of working in a house that's being built here in our local area. It's a $2 million house, and everything in that house is electrical. And I was speaking with a fellow member in there, and we were talking, and said, you turn off the electric in this house, and this thing is nothing but a big hollow wooden box. It's worthless, and it's amazing the mindset that we've gotten into. It's amazing. The things we think we need. But that's that false sense of security that is taught by mankind right now. The same thing that we see with the teaching of Santa Claus coming down the chimney, giving you what you want. Just be a good little boy or girl and you can get whatever you want. Look over to verse 44 if you would, really quickly. Pastor goes on to say that Yahweh has proved that they cannot bring peace through force or through coaxing, through this soothsaying, through this surely you won't die, because there's much coaxing taking place. This fantasy land that they try to get you to live in with a surely you won't die, you can do this, you can enjoy life, vote for me, I'll get you what you want. As long as I have a lobbyist that will pay me something, then we can get it my way. But they become very aware that system is not going to benefit anyone. And the only kingdom that won't fall in these last days, as Yahweh has said from the beginning of time, is the kingdom of Yahweh. That is the only kingdom that will stand sure. That is the only investment a person can make that would actually pan out and actually last. Even the billionaires of this earth, the ones who have everything they think their heart could desire, are dying. Look at these products. You can see an Apple phone in just about everyone's hand. And the man that designed that only lived 56 years, and he fought tooth and nail with medical fields trying to get them to save his life. But in the end, nothing could save him. There was no app for that. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying, they say there's an app for everything. There's not an app. The only app for that is to come to Yahweh's house and to download the 1 cent and apply those things into your mind. But that's, this world teaches that if you have these fun things of the earth, that's what the kings of the east, that's what the quartet is bringing forth, and they're actually fighting amongst themselves. Watch very carefully with Russia and the United States. Remember, Pastor said that you have Russia, China, the United States, and the Catholic Church, and they're all trying to come out on top. And it's not a coincidence that the United States is putting missiles very close to Russia. And it's not a coincidence that Russia's fighting back. And it's not a coincidence that China's standing by watching. And it's not a coincidence that these colleges are actually coming out and being exposed. Yahweh said these things would take place. What you see is a system crumbling. They're trying to stab each other in the back so fast, but while they're trying to get power from another country, from another leader, their system is falling apart in their own countries. It's crumbling apart so fast they don't know which part to actually put back together. And the king's horses and the king's men, well, they're not going to put it back together again, I can promise you that. If everyone will please stand at this time, I'd like to turn the remainder of the class over to the great Kahan, Zephaniah Hawkins.
Shalom, everyone. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. Please be seated. We're in the 10th book of Israel. We are on page 77. We're going to continue where the Kahan left off in roughly the same chapter anyway. And we're going to start off on page 77 with verse 52. And Pastor is talking about this beastly governmental system in Babylon. And in verse 52, he tells us, our Passover lamb was butchered by the whole congregation of Israel because they had or they were given the laws, but they never studied the laws. They never tried to keep the laws, so they never found out how beautiful these laws are. So Yahweh predicted, I'm going to send you my son, and you're going to kill him. The whole congregation of Israel laid hands on this man and killed him, 100% consent. They hung him on a tree, and that was our Passover lamb. Now, I want to get a little bit into, because what occurred there is really quite an astonishing thing when you think about it. 100% of the congregation killed Yeshua Messiah, even though he was the perfect man, and there was no reason to kill him, no valid reason to kill him. So I want to get into a little bit of how it is that Satan got the people to kill Yeshua Messiah. And last week we were reading from, I want to just cover real briefly the beginning of chapter 18 of the second book of Israel, which is going on to perfection, number 18. And it was 3693. Pastor gave a sermon. And on the first column of this sermon, he kind of gives us a great insight into, when you couple it with what he's been teaching us lately, into how this all works, how it is that the people could be driven to a point where they actually want to kill the perfect man. And he starts off and he says, Satan is worried about this feast for some reason. It's probably going to be the best Passover feast we have ever had at the House of Yahweh. Satan is terribly worried about it, and that's why this thing came up in Waco. And this was when Waco was going on. But keep that in mind, because that actually comes in a little bit later. If you'll remember what I'm saying in this sermon today, you will see what I mean about how Satan maneuvers to take away the credibility of Yahweh's people and tries to destroy a work in these last days. She has always done it down through the centuries. Every time Yahweh builds a work or starts a work, Satan comes in and tries to destroy it. Now, to understand the main sentence there that I want you to pay attention to is, I know you don't have these books, but I want to preface this whole thing with this sentence. Satan maneuvers to take away the credibility of Yahweh's people and tries to destroy the work in these last days. Now, credibility, you need to understand what credibility is. Credibility means believability. Okay, so this is what Satan tries to destroy. She tries to destroy the believability of the house in these last days. And then the word maneuver, Pastor uses this word maneuver. Satan maneuvers to take away the credibility. Now, maneuver is another interesting word because that basically means work. Okay, it means a planned and regulated movement or evolution of troops. Keep that in mind because she's doing that, and I'll show you how she's doing that. And it also means, when you go down to the Latin, it means, it comes from the old French word which means to work, basically, to work with your hands. So what Pastor is describing here is he's saying Satan works to remove the believability of the last day's witness in these last days. That's exactly what her work is. That's the nature of her work. And remember, what the work of Yahweh is that you believe into the one sent. Okay? And that's a key to a lot of what's going on in the world. And the work of Satan now is that you don't believe into the one sent. It's really that simple. But it's a powerful concept, because once you understand that, it's kind of like you can understand the scope, the depth, and the nature of the adversarial relationship that Satan has against man. Because once you understand that this is what the job is, to destroy the credibility of Israel Hawkins, then you can kind of see why everything is going on in the world that's going on. Because it's like a lawyer in a court, okay? And Israel Hawkins is a witness. And we're trying to bolster the witness. And Satan, her work is to reduce the credibility, to perceived credibility. Israel Hawkins is 100% credible. That's what the scripture tells us. But in the minds of the people, and whenever I talk about credibility of Israel Hawkins, I'm talking about the perceived credibility of Israel Hawkins, is what she is trying, and you can do this with witnesses in court. You can do it in several ways. You can try to destroy the character of the witness. You can also try to counter the facts that he brings out to show that the facts aren't true, that you can lie about that. And it even gets to the point in some cases where they'll actually kill the witness. And if that doesn't work, they actually get to the point where they'll kill the jury. That's how corrupt things can go. So keep that in mind as to this is Satan's job. Satan's job is the work of Satan, is that you do not believe into the one sent. That's her work. The work of Yahweh is that you do believe into the one sent. And I want you to keep that in mind, because that'll explain a bunch of things that are going on in the world right now. I'll turn over to verse 56 on page 77. Verse 56. And it also gets into this attacking the believability of Israel Hawkins, as Khan was mentioning, this fantasy land that they have when it comes to the shopping and everything. What Israel Hawkins brings out, remember, Israel Hawkins, the House of Yahweh, is the source of all knowledge. And one thing you need to do to destroy the credibility of Israel Hawkins is you actually have to stand against knowledge. And so this is where you get this phrase that I need to escape from reality. Because reality is a strong advocate of the House of Yahweh. I mean, it's a strong witness for the House of Yahweh. Reality is a strong witness for the House of Yahweh. When you escape reality, you actually escape life. When you escape reality, you escape life. Because fantasy will actually reduce the credibility of Israel Hawkins. Because in the fantasy world, you can do whatever you want without getting hurt. In reality, you get hurt. So make sure that in your life, so that you're not taking this position of Satan and not believing into the one sent, reducing Israel Hawkins' credibility, that you don't escape reality. Never think that you want to escape reality, or you want to go on a reality escape. That's a term that they use a lot of times to sell things. Verse 56, well anyway, here's the Lamb now talking to us, and he says in Revelation 6:1, and I saw when the Lamb, who's Yeshua, as you will see in Revelation 1:1, this revelation was given by Yahweh to Yeshua. Yeshua gave it to the heavenly Malachim, who brought it to Yachanan to record. And Yachanan was in prison by this time, by the same beastly system, because he was arrested too for teaching this. So they took him and they put him on their Isle of Patmos. That's where they kept many of their prisoners who they would work in their mines there. When they needed others, or when one died, they just replaced them with another Jew or another Hebrew from the tribe, that was teaching the laws of Yahweh. We'll take you down here to a place, boy, and we'll chain you. We'll put some chains on your feet, and we'll teach you here in this coal mine while you work. Now, verse 57. Well, that's the attitude. That's their love of one another. That's why their kingdom fell too, because they had no love, as Yahweh said. They were without natural affection, brute beasts. And this is talking about not just the system not just the people within the system that are without this affection. It's talking about the system itself. The system itself is a brute beast. And that's why it's called the beastly governmental system. And I want to get into that, because it's not like you have these individuals out there that are individually brute beasts, and if we could just get rid of each one of those, our problem will be solved. They actually work together, and they kind of create this super beast. Okay, which is this thing that we're really working against. Well, this is what we saw in Shaul, and he was changed in a moment. Yahweh proved there that he could take any of these tribes, any of these people out of the tribes who were brute beasts, and change their heart. He says, here you go now to my disciples, and they'll teach you what to do. And he did, and he turned out to be a wonderful apostle who wrote us many books, and they're listed here. He even wrote one to the Romans, too. The Romans, his brothers in Rome, it's called Romans. Now, let's turn over real quick to Romans. I want to read a particular scripture in Romans, because this is, it's in Romans 9, and it's verse 29 on page 881. And this is the thing that Pastor brought out about Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is a huge point right now in the world as far as the House of Yahweh bringing out this fact. Okay, and then in verse 28 he says, for he will finish a work, yet cut it short in righteousness, because Yahweh will make a short work on the earth. Okay, so this gives us a time frame of where this prophecy is. It's at the end. Okay, it's at the end where there's a short work. And as Isaiah said before, unless Yahweh of Sabaoth hosts had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom. In other words, we would have been made Sodomites, and we would have been made like Gomorrah. Now we had this is a teaching of the House of Yahweh, and this is one of these things that pastor can say, the House of Yahweh can bring out this information, it's in the scriptures, and it's a major problem for the world, because if he's right on this, it exposes them, and that's how they look at it. So this is one of the things that they've got to attack his credibility on. It cannot possibly be that they're trying to turn everyone into a bunch of Sodomites. Okay, that just can't be. This would be a big credibility issue for them, and this is something that they want to attack, and they want to pretend like this isn't really what's going on. That this is just a rights group, civil rights, they're just trying to eliminate bullying. The fact that there's actually an organization that's running most of the world, that's trying to turn the whole world into Sodomites, is a pretty incredible statement when you think about it in the world. It's a pretty amazing statement to make. And they've hidden it all this time. Now, they had a story that came out it was about 2 weeks ago, and it was on November 4th, a grand jury which had been convened in September of 2009 or earlier, indicted Jerry Sandusky, and I think most of you have seen this, on 40 counts of sex crimes against young boys. The indictment came after a 3-year investigation that explored allegations of Sandusky having inappropriate contact with a 15-year-old boy over the course of 4 years, beginning when the boy was 10 years old. Now it goes on and it says how this went way back to 1994, and it involved at least 20 incidents. I mean, they don't even know what the count is. But it went way back, and it was reported repeatedly to the administrators of this college, and nothing was ever done. Now, I saw this story, and this came out, I saw it on the Sabbath. It was after the Sabbath that I saw the story. He was indicted on a Friday, and on Sabbath I read this story. And the first thing I thought when I saw this story was, this is really huge. Because this is exactly what Pastor is talking about. The Nimrod system, which is comprised of the media, the colleges, and the government, are being caught in the act of Romans 9:29. They're red-handed. They're caught red-handed. There's like no denying this. This is a huge story, and I knew right away this was a gigantic story. And I want, one of the things I do whenever a story comes out, I want to see who reports it and who doesn't. So I looked through the New York Times and CNN. Those are the two big newspapers, and this is where the government basically it's like their Bible. And this is why they asked Sarah Palin, "What newspapers do you read?" Because this is, you can't just read the Drudge Report to get your news. You've got to read these papers because they throw in the curveball here. And now, and on CNN the next day, it took till the next day, CNN had a little blurb underneath the sports section, way at the bottom of the page, and it said sex scandal at Penn State, which is almost like a, that's almost like a TV show. There's nothing really big there. It didn't mention pedophilia, it didn't mention children. And then the New York Times had nothing. For the Sunday paper and the Saturday paper, they had nothing about this story. Now, they did have a story about Lindsay Lohan. right on the top. And they had a story about skiing in Vermont right at the top. Now, this is the New York Times. Remember, I read this part of this book one time. Pastors mentioned this, where there's a book called Buried by the Times, where the New York Times knew about the Holocaust. They covered it, but they covered it in such a way that no one really did anything about it. They put it, and this is the rich Jews versus the poor Jews. And this is what we're seeing, the exact same thing right now. What's going on is they're actually burying this pedophilia. They're burying the children who are the victims of it, because they're not covering this story, and they're trying to cover it up. And I wanted to see how it is they're going to cover something this huge up. How are they going to circle the wagons? Because we know that this is a huge story, and this is actually their method of operation. This is what these colleges do. This is what they're set up for. This is what these Catholic churches are set up. This is their main purpose. Everything else is secondary. And so with that perspective, I wanted to see how are they going to circle the wagons? Because if they circle the wagons, they're all in on it. That kind of proves it. And this is one of the things that occurred. And the New York Times came out with an editorial on how could something like this occur without anyone noticing? Because that's what everyone would wonder. How can the whole college have this going on for 2 decades with all these boys and all these people reporting it and nothing ever occurred? Of course, the reason is because they're all in on it. Okay, that explains it. But they're never going to report that. Well, guess what? It turns out that the organization itself is a pedophile. That's what's going on. Wouldn't that be a huge story? Penn State organized for the purpose of converting people to sodomites. That kind of a story just wouldn't run. But this is what Romans 9:29 says. This is what Romans 9:29 says. It essentially says Penn State was organized for this purpose. That's what it says. But here they said, okay, this is the New York Times, because everyone's wondering how could this be, so they need to come up with a reason. Okay? What if it had been a 10-year-old girl at Penn State locker room that Friday night? The answer to that question reveals an ugly truth, one that goes stubbornly undiscussed. Whichever version of Mike McQuarrie's story you choose to believe, his grand jury testimony, in which a distraught McQuarrie, then a graduate assistant football team, left immediately after witnessing the former coach sodomize a young boy, it did not stop physically, but I made sure it stopped when I left the locker room. The mind recoils at the gross failure to intervene more forcefully. How could a grown man have left the scene without taking the child with him? McQuarrie wants us to imagine that his brain was racing during those 30 or 40 seconds that he had to make a tough, impacting decision. But it seems clear he wasn't thinking at all, and it's not hard to wonder why. I think it was the gender of the victim. And what the New York Times position here is that the reason that this was not reported is because of homophobia. It's not because they were trying to convert people to sodomy, it's because people are speaking against sodomy. That's why they didn't report it. That's the New York Times position. Now remember, the New York Times buried the Holocaust victims. They let them die. They didn't report it. They put it way in the back of the page, and they hid it among all the others. They're burying the pedophile victims now. And the reason is the New York Times, as the scripture says, was organized for the purpose described in Isaiah, described in chapter 9:29 of Romans. You need to understand that. They were organized for that purpose. That's their purpose. They report news so that they can keep you from getting the news. That's why they went into the news business, to keep you from getting the news. That's why they go into banking, to keep you from having money. That's why they go into the churches, to keep you from keeping Yahweh's laws. They go into preaching so that you won't know what the Bible says. That's the power of darkness. Now, understanding what we know, which Romans 9, and this is his brute beast pastor's talking about, Romans 9:29 says, unless Yahweh of hosts had left us a seed, we would have been made like Sodom, and we would have been made like Gomorrah. These organizations, this is the purpose they were organized for. Okay, so you take that perspective, that understanding that no one else has, and then you look at this interview that Jerry Sandusky did. And this was an interesting interview. He appears on, everything about this is strange, but it's not strange when you know what's really going on. Remember, these organizations are organized for the purpose of promoting sodomy, and they want everyone in the world to be sodomites. Take that perspective now, which the world, of course, doesn't have, and now all this stuff becomes explicable. This man here, by the way, who wrote this story, the story here about Penn State, his name is Dan, who wrote the story about why it wasn't reported because of homophobia. He is a academic. His specialty is Greek tragedy. He has published articles about Roman poetry and Greek religion. In the spring of 2010, he was a critic in residence in the American Academy in Rome. He's written a book, The Elusive Embrace, a memoir entwining themes of homosexual identity, family history, classical myth, and literature. Now, they took this man in order to try to explain, using the power of the New York Times, why that wasn't reported in Penn State. And his proposition is homophobia. It wasn't that they were actually doing it and they're all in on it. No, it's just homophobia. And he doesn't take into account the fact that there was dozens of these incidents. It wasn't just the one McCleary. He doesn't, but he's the expert now. Pull him out of the blue. He pulls an opinion out of his hat, and you look at his background. He's a student of. He writes books on homosexuality. I'm not sure what the implications are there, but I'm sure it's a positive book. It's a positive book on that. That's Daniel Mendelsohn. Now, Sandusky appears on Bob Costas. You know, his attorney actually arranged the interview. Now, attorneys don't do that. They don't want you to appear on the media, and if they do, they tell you don't talk about the case. You can talk about something else, but do not talk about the case. He appeared on Bob Costas, and he talked exactly about the case. Totally about nothing else, just about the case. He talked about the incidents, and he even admitted some things. And if you saw this interview, he talked slow. And he almost talked like, I'm kind of stupid here, but yeah, I did do this and I did do that. But now if you look at this in the perspective of knowing that these organizations are created for the purpose of promoting sodomy, you understand he was making a threat. Because he was talking to the powers that be that were throwing him into this machine, into the teeth of this machine. And basically what he was saying is, I'm willing to talk. That's what that interview was. I'm willing to talk. So get me out of this. And this is what Pastor says. They're not all that unified. Every now and then they will throw one of themselves away. And that was why he was appearing, because he was talking not to the audience, not to Bob Costas, but to the powers that be that are also in on it with him, saying, get me out of here. And I want to show you how they're going to do that. Now, so remember, the purpose of the media is so that you don't know any news. The purpose of them owning the news is so you don't know any. The purpose of the banks is so you have no money. The purpose of the preaching is so you don't know the Bible. And it's to take those places so no one righteous will have them. It's just to take those positions so that you won't have them. Now, enter Louis Free. And he's an investigator now. And he's been assigned to oversee the whole thing now. He's coming in here and he's going to watch. Now, what do you think the purpose of an investigator is? To make sure it doesn't get investigated. Okay, this is the purpose. So remember now, you got to think this way, put yourself into the right perspective with all the news, and you can understand what's going on. So Louis Free, the FBI director, and he's a very respected man, you know, by some people, I think. But he used to be the FBI director. He was appointed now to oversee the whole thing, and no favoritism now. He said, I'll only get involved in this if there's no favoritism. Now, I've met with a lot of attorneys in my life, and I know one thing. If an attorney was among other attorneys and he ever said that, he'd be laughed out of the room, because this is not how attorneys talk. They don't say, listen, I'll only get involved in that case if there's no favoritism. But anyway, this is what supposedly he said. Now listen to who this man is. Free and his wife Marilyn have 6 sons. He's a devout Roman Catholic, although he is not a member of Opus Dei, as rumors have stated. Opus Dei. According to the Bureau and the Mole, a book by David Weiss, Free's son was enrolled at a private heights school in Potomac, Maryland, which Weiss describes as Opus Dei Academy. In other words, this guy's saying, yes, he's a member of Opus Dei, which is a secret organization. He's not going to come out and say. Several of his sons are now enrolled in Acmere Academy, a Catholic school in Claymont. And one of his sons currently attends Georgetown University. I think Georgetown is a Jesuit, but I'm not sure of that. He was the director of the FBI during Waco. During Ruby Ridge, he was the director, and he criticized the local prosecutor's decision to prosecute the sniper who killed that man, even though it was only for manslaughter. He criticized that decision. He began his career as an agent of the FBI and was later an assistant United States attorney and a United District Court judge, the position he held. Remember, now why do they have judges? Why do they take judge positions? So you won't get justice. That's why they take it. They don't want us in there, so they're filling the positions. That's why you see a courthouse on every corner. That's why you see a church on every corner. They want saturation. Remember what it says, they're never satisfied. And when you extend that, when you apply that quality to world leaders of being never satisfied, the unsatisfied lust, you end up with them wanting everything in the world. And that's what you see here. That's why they make sure there's no crack. Nothing gets through these people. He was a district court judge so that no one would get justice. That was his purpose. That was why they put him there. Make sure that doesn't occur. The position he held when he was FBI director, he is now a lawyer and a consultant in the private sector. He's an American. He was born an American. He acquired Italian citizenship on October 23rd, 2009. But this is the one in charge now of making sure that we don't know what went on in that case. This is this perspective that you need to take of Romans 9:29. And Isaiah said, unless Yahweh of Shabbath had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom, we would have been made like Gomorrah. In other words, these organizations are going to be set up throughout the whole world, and their primary purpose is going to be to turn people into sodomites. Their secondary purpose is to nullify their pretend purpose. So we'll make them a sodomite, and while we're at it, we'll make sure they don't get an education. We'll make them a sodomite, and while we're at it, we'll make sure they don't read the Bible. See how we're dealing with spirit beings with extreme intelligence here in setting all of this up. And we're going to be above them in intelligence and understanding and this ability to kind of grasp this whole big thing that they've come up with, which is really quite remarkable when you look at it. Now, Opus D, let's go talk about this one. Opus D, I may not be pronouncing it right, but I think the D, I think I know what that is, formerly known as the Prelature, it's office of the Holy Cross and the Opus D. Latin, it means the work of God. The work of God. So what is Opus D? What's the work of Yahweh that you believe into the one sent? What is Opus D that you do not believe into the one sent? That's what Opus D is. So they've just appointed a man to investigate the sodomy that's going on in these organizations that, according to Romans 9:29, were set up to create sodomites, and that person is a member of an organization whose name is that you do not believe into the one sent. That's their name. It's in Latin, but you need to know a little scripture to decipher it. But that's the name of the organization that he works for. It teaches that everyone is called to holiness and that ordinary life is a path to sanctity. Doesn't that sound nice? Ordinary life is a path to sanctity. Who could argue against that? Well, we do. We do argue against it. In this case, because this is just a phrase that means we infiltrate. Okay? That's what this phrase is. We infiltrate. Okay? Ordinary life is a path to sanctity. In other words, we get involved in everyday life's positions. We become your banker. We become the postmaster. We like the top positions. We become the local judge. We become the investigator, so that nothing is done in these positions except hiding what it is we're really up to. Okay, and that's what this means. They're called to holiness, that ordinary life is a path to sanctity. Ordinary life is an opportunity for the Catholic Church to wedge itself in and make everyone else not believe into the one sent. That's what that means. Okay? It's a governance of a prelate. It's a bishop appointed by the Pope. Opus D is Latin for work of God. Hence, the organization is often referred to by members and supporters as the work. This is who's going to make absolutely sure that no stone is turned in this investigation. that no stone is turned, not unturned. They're going to make sure nothing comes out of this investigation, no matter what Sandusky does. But this stuff is going to come out. It is coming out. So I don't know to what degree this is going to go. Remember, the prosecutor was murdered in this case. The one who was involved in this case was murdered. Whether it was by them, I don't know. But, it's very unusual for a prosecutor to be murdered. You're dealing with, this is their key issue here. And this is what the House of Yahweh is the only one. Remember, it says, if it wasn't for us, if he didn't leave us a seed, what that's saying, you got to see the implications of that too. No one else is going to talk about this. And that's what you see. No one else is. And that puts us in the crosshairs of the targets. And that's why they're going to make us, they can't kill us. Remember, they can kill the witness, they can kill the jurors in a case. But we're in the case where they can't kill the witness and they can't kill the jurors, although they're going to try to wipe a lot of them out. The jurors being the people who the witnesses appeals to, the ones who need to believe this. So this is what they call this, the work. So you have to take all that you see in the news and kind of reverse engineer it and realize that what they're doing, however subtly, and when an issue like this comes up in particular, this, or say there was some big story about pork turning out to be unhealthy, you'll see all the wagons being circled, and then just start looking. It didn't take me any time to research these people. I just looked them up, and all this stuff was there. I wasn't trying to find an Opus Dei. I didn't even know what Opus Dei meant. I look up Opus Dei, I'm like, that's interesting. What does that mean? And it looks like, oh, it's the work of God. Now believe it. Remember, the work of God is that you do not believe into the one sent. The work of Yahweh is that you believe into the one sent. And of course, that is the position. That's the side that we all want to be on. We want to be a part of the work, and we want to be a result of the work, and not a matter of because the other option now is to be like these children victims. That's the other option. And also, we're protecting the whole world from this outcome that they're going to try to hide. And watch the stories and you'll see how they hide it. It's going to be real exciting to me what they're going to ultimately do with this and what their report's going to say. So let's please stand for closing prayer. Father Yahweh, this is Council Fine. You see the last day's witnesses, or Hawkins, your son, our high priest Yeshua Messiah, along with the men of your class, giving you great thanks, Father, for the Sabbath, the understanding, the opportunity, the calling, and the protection, and the ability to see these things as they occur, which is really very, very rare that someone can see them, be around when they're occurring, and understand them as they unfold. And we do thank you for this. Pray for the pastor who gets a full use of the subconscious mind, the sick are healed, that all those in your house are protected from the wicked one, and that they're also protected from these deceptions that try to make them not believe into the one sent. We also pray for the great Khan Yedidia, that you release him from these men in Yeshua Messiah's name. Hallelujah. Praise Yahweh.